Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our double bill today, continuing from where Alan Allport left off, really, because although I have my fair share of what I would call operational historians, where we talk about strategy and we talk about battles, battalion and company and moving across fields, actually, one of the things I really prefer talking about in many ways is just people. And people are covered in Sheer Misery, the book of my guest today, Mary Louise Roberts, Soldiers in Battle in World War II. So we're going to be talking about just the senses one picks up on the battlefield, how you're accustomed to being in combat, trench foot, food, rations, things like that. So Mary Louise Roberts really doesn't need an introduction. She is something of a legend, all sorts of awards, teaches at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I'm going to bring her in now. So good afternoon, Mary Louise.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
So, Sheer Misery. I mean, the title kind of says it all. You know, the experience of the combat soldier in World War II was one of unrelenting misery in many ways. You know, the food, weather, conditions, and then facing your own mortality and that of your friends around you. So, before we kind of begin tackling some of the subjects, where did you get the inspiration for tackling this aspect of World War II?
Well, I think that sheer misery wasn't exactly shared evenly. It was really the infantry, the front foot soldiers, who had much more misery than the rear. And so I was really interested in telling their story rather than their officers' stories. I wrote a book called What Soldiers Do, and I had to read a lot of infantry memoirs for that book. And I really loved these memoirs. These guys reminded me of people I grew up with, really honest guys who are trying to get through day by day against some pretty horrible circumstances. So I began to read them more and more. And as I did, I realized they're very embodied. And by that, I mean that they didn't really know what they were doing. They knew they had to take Hill 622 or something. I mean, they didn't really know, even at the operational level, what the directions were. So they're preoccupied with their bodies, and in particular, their discomfort. They're cold, they're hot, their feet. And I just decided, no one writes about that, really, just how miserable men on the front are. So that was my inspiration for starting the book. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And I raced through it in 2 nights when I read it. And what I appreciated is I was familiar with some of the accounts before. I mean, Donald Burgett, who you quote in it quite a lot, was a good friend of mine. And Roscoe Blunt, I corresponded for several years at 84th Division by the Rail Splitters, and other accounts. Arnhem, Dr. Stuart Mawson, I've read his book before. And it was only by seeing concentrated in one place when you talk about how many people with trench foot or how many people were suffering from fatigue or morale, I realized how it had been written about quite a lot. But as I said, not in one place. You get little fleeting mentions here and there, but putting it all in one place, it was a real reminder of just, as Alan Allport said this afternoon, it's an army is unrelenting boredom for a lot of it. And then you're in the absolute thick of the fighting, and then it is sheer misery. So to take off a question before we get into the topics themselves, Alan was talking about the fact that when the veterans first came back from World War II, it was something they just grumbled about. And the affection for serving in combat perhaps arrived in the 1980s and 90s as they got older and they were looking back on their lives. In sourcing your material, because you used a mixture of diaries, contemporary diaries, you used the work of other historians' interviews and things. Did you see any kind of change and progression of how men talked about the war through the decades in terms of historiography?
That's a really interesting question. I don't remember seeing anything. The thing about bodily experience is that it's very reliably remembered. I guess in your brain, your memory function is very very close to your senses. So I would say that I thought the memories were reliable throughout. The only thing that was different was I went to Carlisle, where there's the Military History Institute, and they have a very large collection, a wonderful collection there, of men who served anywhere overseas. And so these were not memoirs, although memoirs were attached to them. They were just questions. But many of them were much more grumpy, I would say. They were fulfilled, filled out maybe closer to the date and much more grumpy, particularly about the food and feet. But in general, I think the memories stayed pretty true to misery. There was still a lot of complaining. Yeah.
No, I agree. And I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of World War II veterans over the years living in Normandy. And I think one of the things I've learned in interviewing and speaking to them is they may sometimes get the detail of which day a battle took place or who was commanding the division but
Right.
they won't get the emotional memories wrong. If they said they were terrified in the foxhole, they were terrified in the foxhole. If they said that they were cold all the time, they were cold. I mean, emotional memories, as you said yourself a minute ago, are eternal and true. So the details of campaigns can get lost over time. But let's kind of dive in, because I said it in that introduction there that the senses, your opening kind of chapter of the book is really about the senses of these guys, and that is the smell of the battlefield, the taste of food, and this development of what men would call that combat sense. So is that a chapter you thought when you started the book would be a chapter? Was that something that came about when you started going through these infantrymen's accounts?
Yeah, no, I really took my direction from them. I think probably sound was the one that they talked about the most. Of course, they complained about the food, right? So it was just funny. But sound was really interesting because it performed enormous functions for them strategically. Because obviously artillery in the Second World War, if you see it, you're being seen. So soldiers really relied on sound to locate themselves in the battlefield. And they also grew really skilled at figuring out what kind of weapon was being aimed at them and whether or not it was going to hit them. So it was important in that they could strategically, hopefully, place themselves out of fire. But even if they couldn't, I think it really helped them in their fear to know, where it's coming from and what kind of weapon it is. So it was strategic in that way. And I think that's why so many of them talked about it. It also became the senses in general, but hearing in particular, became a way for members of a unit to bond with each other. So when replacement soldiers came on the line, the first thing they would tell them is, about the different kinds of sounds and how you could hopefully get out of the bomb's way. So it became a way in which older members of the unit could brag and show their knowledge about combat. And these are replacement units, so there's ambiguous feelings about them, right? First, sadness about why they're being replaced, but also like some condescension and worry that the replacement soldiers are going to put them in harm's way. So it became, in a really interesting way, a bonding way to give the new ones fair chance, and also to show how war savvy you've become. So yeah, go.
And do
Yeah.
you think it's almost for them to also take a bit of control? Because if you are a foot soldier, if you're PBI, poor bloody infantry,
Right.
your life is in everybody else's hands. There are commanders telling you what to do. The weather you have no control over. You can't control over what the enemy are doing. But if you maybe can at least convince yourself that you can understand the artillery rounds coming in, oh, that's an 88, that's going to not hit me, and that's a 105, that's going to miss me, that's going to... It's an element of being able to take some control of the battlefield, as well as the practical results of it. It's you staking your claim on taking control of your life. Do you think that's part of it as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. It was, a way to gain some control. Yeah, I totally agree with you about that. Yeah. The other thing is that the Germans had a different sounding machine gun than the Americans, and so Americans who are about to shoot into the bushes would recognize that it was an American gun rather than a German gun, and so it saved lives too. So yeah, definitely, I agree. It's a control mechanism. Yeah.
But I think of the senses, though, I think the one that is the most interesting to read about is smell, because it's the one that those of us who weren't in World War II had the least understanding of, because we can understand the sounds because we can watch war movies, we can see news footage, we can understand the imagery because, again, we've seen the photos, but the smell of battlefields, the smell of being in combat, I think is something we can't possibly imagine. So talk about some of the men you wrote about and what they experience of the smells of death, the smells of battlefield, and some of the discoveries you made.
Well, first of all, when I've given this to audiences that have veterans in it, even though I'm not replicating the smell that they had, over the years, I would have to say literally dozens of vets came up to me and said, oh, I remember the smell of the hospital. I remember the smell of the battlefield. So even though the smell wasn't really the same, it was close enough to evoke their memories of the smell. So smell had no strategic value, unlike sound, but it still defined the battlefield. So, if you're on leave or you're coming back, you're getting close to the battlefield because it smells. And what were the smells? The smells were the smell of dead bodies, and it was cordite, which is one of the main forms of explosives used, and it's also the smell of burnt bodies. So one of the things I argued in that part of the census chapter was that if sound is the sound of something coming, smell was the something that came and went, because of the cordite and because of the burnt bodies and because of the dead bodies. So death left its trace on the battlefield through smell.
Definitely, and if at any point you want to give examples of, then please feel free. But the food, I think, is we'll move to as well, because Napoleon always said, supposedly an army marches on its stomach, and the two. I was reading recently about the British Army, surveys done of the British Army from like the 1800s right up to date, and the two things that the British Army have always grumbled about the most are boots and food. It's never changed. It's their footwear, and we will get to the feet and trench foot later on in the discussion, but food. I know obviously there's the practical fact that the armies are having to fight a war. We can't back then spend time sending catering classes out the front doing haute cuisine and trying to get souffles to rise in the Hurtgen forest. Clearly food has to be practical, and everybody in the service must have understood that food has to be compromise, quality has to be some compromise over quantity, and yet they do bitch about it all the time. Why do soldiers bitch about food all the time?
Well, I think it's two things. One, again, it's about a bonding issue, right? That soldiers come together. My students, if they hate a book, it's always a bonding moment for them. So I think it's the same function, right? It's their privilege and duty as infantrymen, because they're already feeling like they're at the bottom of the heap. And when they get bad food, it makes them feel that way more and more, that they're, the sort of bloody infantry, right? So I think that's why, one, but I also think the food was really bad. And I deal with both the British and the American. And I just quote one guy who said, look, I know we're not going to get steak, but, this is really bad. The British, they had what they called biscuits, they called dog biscuits, and they used them to line the trenches so that they could stay dry. That was how much they hated it. And the Americans had K and C rations, and they were completely hated, particularly the C rations, because there were three kinds. And I think it was the vegetable one, which, because I went to quartermaster and saw how all these things are made. One guy said, you have to be starving or have perverse appetites in order to get this down. It was just. But I think the worst part for everyone was when the food was cold, or even frozen. So K rations and C rations were only supposed to be used over a short period of time. So if someone's on an operation, they can't get back to the lines, or if it's too dangerous for the cook to come up to the front lines. But they often ate them, like at the Battle of the Bulge, they ate them 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And they were ecstatic even when they got C rations that were heated. Because food is about nurturance, right? And it's a pleasure, it's a life pleasure. There was one GI who I particularly loved, Leroy Stewart, and he said he started to get a recurring dream, which was he would wake up in the hospital and there before him was a huge plate of steaming mashed potatoes. And he would have this dream every night. So it just shows you, especially like both the British and the American boys, their associations with food are like cakes that their mother would make specially for them, or, special meals, whether they were macaroni and cheese or kidney pie, just special warm things. And I think that complaining about food tapped into that homesickness, really.
No, great answer. And talking about food reminds me, as it moves really to bodily functions, because I did a lecture at the National Army Museum in London like 20 years ago about food. And one of the things I found, as you said there, you hinted at, is that the K rations and 24-hour rations essentially contain ingredients to make you, well, there's no easy way of saying it, shit less.
Right.
So that you're, but if you're on them for a prolonged period of time, what happens is that when you come off them, kind of the dam breaks, so to speak. And without going into bodily functions in too much detail, that's again something that I hadn't realized how many times I'd read books where there are references to just how difficult it was to go for a crap in the middle. And you putting on, so that was something that you found in quite a few accounts, people just describing the misery of just keeping clean and you going to the toilet.
Yeah, I mean, on top of all the other problems with food, you had flies that were, as much as the two armies, the British and the American Army, tried to keep hygienic conditions, it was, you're outside, you have flies. So dysentery was a huge problem. And yeah, there are very many accounts of it in the book. Again, no one really talks about this that much, and it was very underreported because there was so much shame associated with it, particularly when it happened during an artillery attack or when men do it out of fear. With each other, again, there was no talk about it. There was one young man, an American GI, who shit his pants during a battle, and it was really bad. And his comrades cleaned him up, threw away the underwear, did the best they could, and then they never talked about it again. So this is another bonding issue, right? That there's some things you're not going to kid a man about. I mean, there's a lot of joking and kidding on the front line, but this was something that was mostly kept silent.
I remember speaking to an Omaha veteran, I forget which one it was now, years ago, and we were talking about Saving Private Ryan, and about how the sound was all the surrounds. He said, but it didn't have the smelly vision, because I can tell you most people in my landing craft shat themselves, and if they didn't shit themselves, they'd vomited. So he said this, in some ways, we were just happy to get out of the boat because it was just a floating pool of misery. And he said that I hadn't felt comfortable talking about that for years because it was something men don't do. Men don't talk about things they only do when they're babies, and yet It was surprisingly common, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And in the introduction to the book, I compare defecation with urination. So they're different. Defecation was all about shame and privacy and humiliation. Urination was a sign of power. I talk about it in the introduction to show how separate meanings are associated with bodily functions, so that they become not just bodily functions, but cultural codes, and have a cultural history. So urination in the Rhine became a very big thing to do. Patton did it, Eisenhower did it, and Churchill did it. Of course, when Churchill did it, he decided not to have it filmed, but when Patton did it, he did. And there is a picture in the book of Patton urinating in the Rhine. once he did it, everyone wanted to do it. The whole idea was we're crossing the Rhine, so screw the Germans, we're going to urinate in your river. I have to say,
Helen Patton's granddaughter is one of my best friends, and Helen is sent the photo of her grandfather pissing in the Rhine about 10 times a month. People assume she's never seen it before. Is these the most frequently sent to? I believe she said that photo she ever gets sent. So yes, I've seen it before. Yes, my granddad pissed in the Rhine. But yeah, so soldiers being embarrassed, things like that, I think is a social issue. But the real problem, this is the heart of senses, is the blank stare, the 1,000-yard stare. So that's something else that again comes up a lot in the accounts you read. So for those who don't know, these people who are writing about it, they're obviously describing the same psychological trait. They give it different language because perhaps like PTSD, it hadn't been given a label. But how would you summarize the blank stare for someone who doesn't understand that concept?
Great question. So I talk about it in the census chapter because I think it can be very simply described as somebody gets, on sensory overload. I mean, if you add up the enormous fear of the noises and the smell and the sight of dead bodies everywhere, and then, the constant use of adrenaline to fight, I think they go on overdrive in terms of senses. And so they just shut down. That's how I would explain the stare. They just shut down because they can't take anymore. I would not call it PTSD because it's not post.
No, it's during traumatic.
Yeah, it's during. Yeah. Exactly.
I was going to say DDT, but that's something else, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, so that understanding of people, just failing in combat. So in the accounts you discovered about that, sometimes they're writing about themselves, but sometimes they're writing about other people. And do you think generally it was something that the men in the poor bloody infantry understood it perhaps better than the folks back home and the people in the rear lines? Because if you were there in the sharp end, you realized you were yourself only seconds away from breaking a point. But the further away from the front line, the more stigma I think is attached to that blank stare. Would that you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at Bill Malden, and I do a chapter on him, Willie and Joe are the real heroes because they're the ones that are on the front line. And the way Malden portrays people in the rear who are people of higher classes, right? They're middle class, and they're officers and they're sitting behind desks. There's a completely different experience. Guys at the front understand each other. They understand what they're going through. The rear does not get it at all. So they loved Malden because Malden showed the experience they were actually having versus the officer's experience.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Bill Malden because he came up in the sidebar already in conversation, and I really want to spend a few minutes talking about him because I see he's a very significant figure because his cartoons, two things happened. He was on the front line talking about what he saw and what he experienced, that then went out again, back to GIs, but then it went upstairs to the generals and the people who then tried to influence what he's writing about. For those who don't know what we're talking about, folks, we're talking about the famous Willie and Joe cartoons of the two bedraggled, dirty, unshaven GIs of mythology who sit in foxholes and speak in that kind of slang style, and summing up, as you said yourself there, the sheer misery and humor to be found in service. But Bill Malden's experience in terms of how the army, notice general pattern, we talked about him pissing in the river. Explain about how Malden's cartoons incur the wrath of Patton.
Okay, so it's well known that Patton was a clean freak. I think Paul Fussell said, his soldiers died with the tie between the second and third button. And so I think Patton hated Malden because he believed that these dirty, bedraggled soldiers were basically soldiers who were undisciplined and were not keeping themselves clean, and Malden was heroizing them. So he felt pretty uncomfortable with that. And he decided sometime in 1944, 45, I can't remember exactly when, I think it was 45, that he was not going to allow Stars and Stripes into the Third Army because that was the newspaper in which Willie and Joe by Malden appeared. And Malden himself was in the 36th ID, and he came up from the ranks. He started as a cartoonist for the division, the 36th Division newspaper, and then he became so popular they gave him a Jeep, and then he became a cartoonist for Stars and Stripes. Patton just didn't want to show this cartoon in the Third Army, and he wanted Eisenhower to get rid of it. Now, as well known, Eisenhower really believed that there shouldn't be too much censorship or control over Stars and Stripes, that it should tell the truth of the war, that it shouldn't be a propaganda rag. And he knew that the cartoon was really, really popular. So he decides what he's going to do is he's going to send Malden to talk to Patton and see if he can get Patton to come around a little bit. So, Willie and Joe, again, are filthy dirty. They've grown their beards. So what they do with Malden is like they clean him up to a polish, right? I mean, he's about as clean as he's ever been. Everything is shaven. Malden actually didn't need to shave that much. And they send him to Patton's office. And no sooner is he, on the carpet, he says he's met the four meanest eyes he's ever met, which was Patton's eyes and then Patton's dog's eyes. Malden takes out a cartoon Patton takes out a cartoon from the drawer and just starts to scream at him. And Malden takes it. And then finally, as he said, I got out with my skin alive, comes outside. And in the end, they did not censor Malden's cartoon. It continued on. So, and the reason they didn't, I think, is two things. One, it was incredibly popular. Yeah. But two, I really think Malden's purpose, or at least his effect, was to make American GIs feel good about their appearance. Again, this is, dirt and dirtiness is associated with immorality. And, I always show my students a picture of Saddam Hussein when he's arrested, like his dirty appearance was associated with his evilness. And I think that Malden saw a lot of humiliation with soldiers who had been on the line in the mud, particularly in Italy, and had just really felt ashamed of themselves. And so what he tried to do was say, hey, this is okay. Not only is this okay, but you're the real heroes of this war, not the people in the rear, because you're the one who's really fighting and dying. And it worked because towards the end of the war, the guys on the line could sell, their jackets and their combat gear that was all damaged. And as Malden himself said, if you have a jacket with a real genuine bullet hole, you're going to get a lot of money for that. So the idea was to make, a somewhat humiliated, dirty GI feel good about himself. And I think that made a huge difference in terms of why he was so popular and also why he was so important. And he did win the Pulitzer Prize in 1945 for one of his cartoons in which people look pretty dirty.
Well, thank you for explaining the story, and just to sort of continue on that theme about the fact that it's considered, dirty, and you're letting yourself down if you're unkempt, things like that. I think that's an interesting thing because there's a disconnect again between the senior officers and the men. Because if you read too many biographies and diaries of the General Montgomerys, is that although some of them are very popular with their men, they don't really necessarily understand that day-to-day misery, and feel that as a dirty soldier is inefficient. And what you're saying is, whether it was inefficient or efficient, it was just how it was, and there was no getting away from it, because the limits were there wasn't enough soap, there wasn't enough water. So again, like the food, again, soldiers are doing their best to keep clean, and they're shaving if they can. Is it about control again? Trying to be to take control of the situation?
Well, the practice of not shaving started in the Italian mountains in the fall and winter of 43, and everything had to be backpacked up the mountain. Yeah. Right? Dead men came down, supplies went up, and there was only so much water they could get up there. So the guys the British and the Americans had the choice between drinking or cleaning. And not only that, but, and this is a real value of being on the front line, none of the officers were going to come up the mountain. So there's a Malden cartoon that says, look, nobody's coming up here. Let's just drink this, not use it to get clean. So I think that was how it started, right? Because Italy was just a mud bath. And then the mountainous warfare was extremely difficult to supply. And then I think Malden made it enough of a trend to be dirty that people started doing it as a kind of resistance to something like Patton. And I personally love that, because in some ways they're using their bodies to control the situation. Yeah, I love that. It's great.
And you can be in the soldier, and you can be patriotic and doing your job to defeat the enemy, but still bitch and gripe about the army. Those things are not, you can have both those things going on in your head at the same time. And I think that's one of the things that comes across in your book, is that these men were never shirking away from their duty. They were not want to say happy to be in the fight, but they were committed to their job. But that doesn't mean that they aren't going to grumble about porridge for the 17th time in a week, and the shitty biscuits and but moving on from I'm not going to say the trivialities, because going for the toilet is necessary, but the food and to the very serious aspect of being wounded and being killed. And I think one of the things that you discussed, and Alan Allport discussed, and Jonathan Fennell discussed, is that I think you ask most people on the street about if they had to serve in a war, what would you be scared of? They would say dying. But actually, it seems that more people are scared not of dying, but of being incapacitated by wounds. So was that something you thought you were going to discover when you started researching, or is it just became clear when you got into the accounts that it was that fear was more universal than that of death?
Actually, that's a great point. I don't think I knew about that. I actually wrote the dead chapter first.
Right.
I got into that first and then wrote other things. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I loved, and again, I think this is a control issue. You're so right on, is, guys would sit around and talk about what kind of wounds they wanted to have. Okay, so the best one, the British called it the Blighty wound, yep, and the Americans called it the $1 million wound, was to just get wounded enough so you're off the line. Okay, like an arm or a leg, preferably a leg, and so then you would be sent back to London or Blighty, or you would get $1 million in the sense that you were out of the line. But other than that, there were two other wounds that people really didn't want to have. And you can guess the number one. No one wanted to go home without their genitals. And then number two, people were really afraid of tank fires. People who were in tank units, the fires would start and they'd get burned all over their body. Nobody wanted to do that. And then I guess a third would be going blind. So it was a really interesting thing to me that, yes, they preferred to just go. Sometimes they wanted to go. They were so miserable. But if they had to be wounded, they had a hierarchy of wounds. And the idea was to get wounded enough, but not so wounded you would be disabled the rest of your life.
I mean, that's a good point. And it reminds me of a chat I had with Peter Hart, who was the archivist at the Imperial War Museum for like 20 years. His last book, Burning Steel, about the Fife and Forfar yeomanry in the European theatre. And we were discussing the fear that unit had of being burnt alive in tanks. And we also, in the same week, we discussed the fact that actually in the Normandy, there weren't that many tanks that burnt up. It was an earlier war thing. But we're going back to smells again. If you are in an American tank unit or a British tank unit, or anybody who has passed an armored vehicle with burning bodies inside or burnt bodies inside it, that smell is going to stick with you for the rest of your life. And anytime you get a hint of that fear or that smell again, it's going to present the idea of the fact that you're going to be burning to death in a tank, even if that possibility has been reduced dramatically. So we're back to the combination of fear and senses and the experience of soldiers again.
Yeah, and even when their tanks are not burning, that was like a stink spot. You know, you had 3 or 4 guys in there who hadn't taken a shower for a long time. You know, and in the summer it was very hot in those tanks, and it was, you know, almost unbearable sometimes for people.
And we're getting comments about the fact that it's a very scatological bodily function show, but I think that's the point. Is I think there's a certain audience of people who watch my shows and others who love the gear. They love talking about the P51D or the P51C and the change of designation of they love the tech, they love the gear, and that's fine to be that kind of person. But the reality is that these men who went away and women who went away for a long time, they're human beings first, and they're having to deal with just the sheer misery of being in combat. So, from moving to slightly from wounding per se to physical health, because that's something that when we understand wounded in terms of the morning reports, when you're looking at archives and a certain number of men are not in combat that day, we tend to think of it as the ones on the stretchers with blown off legs, things like that. And of course that exists, but a lot of it, it's the other things. It's the dysentery, the fatigue, combat fatigue, and the big one we said we're going to talk about it is trench foot. So most people, or a lot of people watching, will associate trench foot as a First World War thing because of British Tommies and Canadian Tommies standing in those trenches, but actually, in the winter 44, 45, in the US Army, it was an epidemic, wasn't it? So tell us more.
Yeah, no, the British learned their lesson. And so by the Second World War, they had really good boots. And the Americans did not. And I actually went back and looked at the quartermaster records on this. One of the problems they were not good boots was because they were made of recycled rubber. And of course, you know, rubber is a hot commodity during the war because of tires and tire tracks and so on. So they really leaked. And then they were in terrible conditions in 43, 44, and 44, 45 because they were in mud. Oftentimes, you know, the trenches would fill up in water and then they would freeze. So trench foot is not like frostbite. It's not a result of feet freezing. It's the result of feet being in wet, cold conditions just above freezing. And that described a lot of their operative conditions in both those winters, but particularly the winter of 44, 45. But I also talk about how it has to do with male stoicism and their training. So why did so many men get trench foot and many of them did not seek medical help until they couldn't walk? And by then it was too late. And many of them had to have their feet amputated. So why didn't they seek help, you know, some kind of help? So I go back to basic training and I talk about endurance training. And I recognize that endurance training is absolutely central to modern warfare, right? If you can't endure and you can't last in brutal conditions, you're not a good army. But at the same time, what endurance training taught men was to ignore their body signals. You know, pain is a signal that your body, something's wrong. right? And so, whether they were going on, 24-mile runs or, whatever, they learned to endure, to carry on despite bodily pain. So, and it has to do with manliness and masculinity. And so on the line, if a man went and got his feet taken care of, he was considered a bit of a sissy. Anytime he gets sick for something that's more minor, dysentery as well. And then, of course, for that man, not only was he humiliated and shamed, but he would go back to the hospital and would see all these severely wounded people. And he'd say, I'm not going to take any doctor's time for this. And they would go back on the line. So it was really an interesting, the foot is so fascinating anyways. Like a lot of people say, who I've talked to a bit more, that there's no more important part of the body than the foot, particularly for the foot soldier. And what was also interesting to me was that the foot can be a sign of both incredible strength and incredible cowardice. To stand on your own 2 feet was strength, but also to pussyfoot was cowardice. And you can think of a million idioms that go that way. So on some level, trench foot was a shame, right? You couldn't stand on your own 2 feet. But at the same time, a lot of guys on the line realized, hey, I could get off the line. This is $1 million wound here, or this is a blighty wound. So it became in some ways a site of discipline in the sense that the Army said it was indiscipline, and that if soldiers only would just clean their feet and dry their feet. And this was in Life magazine in 1945. This is how basically, the officer corps dealt with it. And the soldiers were pissed, that they were being blamed for this because they had poor equipment and poor operative conditions. And there's one guy I loved who said, look, why don't they also tell us that we need to take a break at 3:00 for cookies and milk and brush our teeth 3 times a day? They were just pissed. And they began to realize, okay, you know what? I could use this to get off the line. So it was a really complex, it used to be there was actually a Purple Heart for trench foot. And then the Army realized maybe not. So more and more towards the end of the war, people were praying to get trench foot. People were actually trying to get trench foot to get off the line. So it was a really, everything from poor equipment to poor operative conditions to the soldiers blaming, the officers blaming the soldiers. It turned out to be an incredibly complex phenomena.
Well, the fact is, you devoted an entire chapter to it, and if I remember, one of the bigger chapters just the feet. And I thought, well, how can there be enough? And you managed to fill up an entire chapter about feet. And you quoted Don Baguette, who I said was a friend of mine in A Company 506, and about how he in the Baston, in his great book 7 Roads to Hell, how he can no longer feel his feet. He knows he's walking, but he no longer has that physical feeling of his feet touching ground because they're just frozen solid. But he explained to me once, we were sitting in a bar in Norney about someone asked him about how do you change your socks in Baston, and he went through the procedure of, okay, even if you've got dry socks and you haven't got dry socks, how you've got to take your gloves off, which your hands are, and then you've got to warm up your hands long enough to unlace your boots, and then take your boots off. Then you've got to raise your foot in the air somewhere because you can't put it down the ground because everywhere around you is snow and ice and mud. And he said it was a simple thing. When I was back home, he said one of the things he said is that I didn't appreciate till I got back home how easy it was to change shoes, because in your living room, I put my boots on to go in the garden, you change your shoes. He said in the field, it's a huge rigmarole, and so I just left them on.
Yeah,
I just left them on for weeks because it was too much, and that is the kind of revelation that when you read it, it makes sense that it became something that just forget about it. Just as they said, the training had told them. It's just what that Sergeant Major phrase, pain is just weakness leaving the body. You hear that said by instructors.
Yeah, my gym person says that.
Yeah. And that's the disconnect. Sorry, I'll let you talk about the disconnect between preparing men for war and training them is one thing. But then preparing them for combat is a different thing. And there wasn't necessarily back then a combat familiarization thing where they say, okay, now all this bullshit about running 24 miles a day, that was to get you fit. Now you're here. It's about keep taking care of yourself. And I don't think anyone bothered to sort of transition the men from that training phase to the combat phase.
Right. Two other things too. In one, soldiers didn't take off their boots because number one, an attack could happen anytime, so they slept in their boots. But also because they were really afraid they wouldn't get them back on, because their feet had swollen so much from trench foot that if they took them off, then they wouldn't be able to fit into them anymore. So those are two things. And then the third thing is just really important, is that the quartermaster did try to get certain equipment, like rubber boots and, a new kind of boot and everything. This was particularly in Italy, rubber, overshoes. And what happened was that they would land, in Naples, and they would be cherry picked by the officers in the rear. So these guys who had trench foot would go home on leave, or, back to Naples on leave, and they would see everybody walking around with these fantastic foot gear that they themselves have been denied because there were none left by the time they would get there, and there'd be size 5 and size 14. So there was a real problem with distribution, which was, again, the poor bloody infantry, right?
We're back to rations again, because I remember the British veterans I spoke to saying some of them, it wasn't until after the war they found out that there were 5 or 6 different types of ration. But the thing is, as you said, that when they were unloaded on the beach, the Royal Army Ordnance Corps got their preference, and the military police got their preference, and by the time it got to the front, you had the ones that no one else liked. You had the city examples, and the same thing applied to gear. The same thing applied to socks, all those creature comforts. And again, it's something that we don't talk about enough. Just the closer you are to the point of the spear, you're winning the war, but you're also the furthest away from creature comforts.
Yep, that's right. And supply, so the people who really needed it didn't get it. And then the people who slept in a bed every night had, nice dry feet. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of this is class, and people don't really talk about that, but less so in the American case, and more so in the British case, but definitely class.
No, definitely. So I want to move now to death now, because
we've
been through scatological, but in some operational studies, because of what they're trying to talk about, they will say, and at the end of this battle, so-and-so corps lost 17,000 or whatever, and they would break it down as a statistical understanding. So, but the enemy lost even greater numbers, and they would explain that this is therefore an Allied victory or whatever it would be. But the reality is, for most of these young men who experienced combat, this was certainly their first seeing of death on a large scale. I mean, they may have been to funerals and stuff, but so what were some of the overriding common denominators amongst men dealing with seeing their first person killed, and the piles of bodies, and the smell of again rotting corpses and things? Again, it's a bit disgusting conversation, but it's important to talk about. So what are some of the common themes that came up in the research?
Well, I talk a lot about it's basically like 6 different ways to look at a body. And I look at how Eisenhower looked at it. I looked at how the French looked at bodies based on like French research. And then at the end, I look at how the graves registration, these are the men that came and took the bodies away. And at the end, I look at the American GI. This chapter is just about the Americans. And I play on this notion, which I think is so interesting, that when you see a dead body, the person is there, but they're not there. Anybody who's seen a dead body knows that, that the body's there, but the soul isn't. So the person is there and not there. And I think for a lot of soldiers, they would look at that. The first thing they would think is that could be me. It made them realize, the stakes of the game here are really high. But they also saw, if it was somebody they knew, they saw 2 ways of looking at the body. One is the person they know and love, has a wife, has a family, has 2 kids, and the other is an abstract body. And I think they felt that was the way the Army looked at them, as an abstract body. I used the notion of manpower, that, and this was important for officers, right? They were putting men in harm's way. They had to abstract them and think about them as units of force rather than as human beings with, families and everything. They couldn't have done what they needed to do. Patton said this once, I have to be really careful not to, think about them as real people. I have to abstract them as manpower. Otherwise, I couldn't do my job. So the GIs look at that and they think, oh, okay, I see John and the Army sees an abstract body. And I ended with this, one of my favorite stories. It was one of the first stories I came across. And it's about the surgeon, and it's late in the war. They're in Germany. And he's seen a lot of death, this surgeon. And they're advancing. They had just won over a German village. And they look at a guy named Wally, who was very popular in the unit. And he's lying by the side of the road, and he's going to lie there until Graves registration comes. And Graves registration put him in a mattress bag. That's what they used, and take him away. And in the meanwhile, there's all these German spitting on him, like in particular German woman spitting on him. And the unit just decides this is not going to happen. Like one of the guys says, you can't do this to Wally. So, they know Graves registration is going to see him as an abstract body, but they're seeing him as Wally. So they decide they're going to do something about it, so at least he's not going to get run over by a tank or spit at by German women. They take up his body and they start carrying it as a group. And as they start carrying it, they explain the situation. And pretty soon, the company is going down to bury him in some way. And then, of course, the officer comes along and says, well, you can't do this. This is, you got to just put him on the side of the road. Graves registration will come. And, and one of them says, don't you realize, guys, that we're just, meaningless to this officer? For him, we're just pins on a map. And they don't care about Wally. And so despite the fact that they're forbidden from doing so, they continue on. And they get to this absolutely beautiful field with red and blue flowers. And they think this is a great place to leave Wally, because of the red and the blue. And so they put his body down really gently. And as they do, he disappears into flowers, essentially. And then each of them go by and make their, it's a little bit like, other stories, but they go by and make their last, goodbyes. And they all know that Graves registration will come at some point, but they're happy that they gave Wally to the flowers. And that's how I end the book, because, again, it's the body here that serves, not unlike Trenchfoot, it's the body that serves here as the instrument of resistance against authority. And the need to be recognized as human beings as well as manpower. So that's kind of the spirit of the book.
Well, I think that we'll do some questions in a minute, but I think that is why it's an important read, because in conventional military histories, the operational ones, the infantry, the units, they're units that are tools in the Allied arsenal of defeating the Germans, and it's about the companies and battalions and regiments and troops and squadrons.
Right.
But the reality is, it's human beings making up that. And your book isn't. It's not anti-establishment. It's not. You're not critical of them. You're just saying these men are just bitching because they're human beings, and human beings bitch when things aren't going well. Then you're not scathing of the government, things like that. You're just saying this is the reality of it. But we've got a couple of questions coming in. So Rob Crane is asking. It's interesting. It might touch on your other work as well. What did you come across about attitude to short leaves when people in, say, France couldn't really get very far in the time allowed? How did they feel about going back? Did some not want to leave? So I think he means that in both ways. Like, did some was it even worth leaving the front line for 4 or 5 days? Surreal, go back, have a shower, and then go back into the front line. And for those who did go on leave, was it difficult to then go back to the front line again? What are experiences generally about leave and furlough in World War II?
I didn't really look at that much because it doesn't have to do with the body. It was absolutely impossible for Americans, right? Yeah. They usually got passes to Paris or somewhere in Switzerland, but for the British, I think it was really difficult to go back just for a while and then come back. But most of them did not want to, quote, desert their comrades. But I think the most neurotic soldiers in the Second World War were the pilots, because the pilots would go and do something incredibly dangerous, but then they'd go home, and be safe. And I think that's harder on the human psyche than just constantly being in danger, because what your psyche does is it numbs out, and you get used to danger, and so going back for those pilots back to the UK, I think was more stressful than just staying at the front all the time. But it's not something I really wrote on, so that's just the best I could do.
Oh, thank you. And we're going to have comments about the fact that did you cover the Axis, the Germans, the Italians? And obviously you didn't in the book. And I think it brings up the greater subject of the ability, certainly at the time, for people within the Germans to gripe and grumble. I mean, it may have been frowned upon by the higher ups and the British and the Americans that the GIs and Tommies are grumbling, but you couldn't get in trouble for it. But in the Third Reich, I'm assuming that there was potentially trouble for rocking the boat and grumbling too much. So I think a book about the German experience would be very difficult because there are that fewer accounts in existence, and they probably weren't able to be so honest. But to finish off, I think I want to ask you about any other themes you think my audience should understand about the experience of the American or British and Canadian soldiers that should help them in their when they're reading, a James Holland book, a Peter Caddick Adams, a John McManus book. Anything that people should remember about what these guys are experiencing on a day-to-day basis that should be in the back of your mind when you're reading an operational history?
I think what I really took away from these memoirs, and again, these men are like guys I grew up with, working class guys who work really hard. What came across to me, and what I think they need to remember, is that these are human beings, and they're funny, and they make the best of it. There's many points of laughter in the book. So it's not really about sheer misery. It's really about the human ability to endure terrible circumstances and form bonds with each other and community, and get through it with humor. I'll just end with one moment. There was one British guy who got shot through his butt cheeks. Okay. So he actually had 4 entry and exit wounds. And at one point, the doctor was dressing him, and, some working class lad goes, from where I sit, Johnny's got 5 holes in his arse. I mean, this is just fun, humorous stuff. And of course, everyone laughed, and he laughed too. So the dignity and the strength of these men, that not sheer misery, is what I tried to get across.
Yeah, I mean, and it's that, humor in adversity is something that I think would unite all soldiers, regardless of which flag they're fighting under, is that shared experience of those on the front line is laughing when times are bad, and bonding even over the negativity and even the loss of life and the wounds. It's a bonding experience. I think that's important to discuss. So well, it's been absolutely remarkable talking to you. What's your future projects in terms of World War II? Are you got more writing ahead of you?
Yeah, no, I started this book actually as looking at both women's and males' bodies. And then I realized I was writing 2 different books. So I'm now working on the women's bodies. So I'm working on war and the female body. And it's I don't know if it's going to be a book yet, but I have something on the women in French resistance. I also spent a year at West Point as a teacher, and so I spent a lot of time in the archives there looking at the first women who came to West Point, and how the administration at West Point had to deal with different kinds of bodies. I'll put it that way.
Right. Okay.
And then there's something on Italy too. It's very eclectic at this point. One of the chapters is going to be published next year, but in general.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I can't wait to read more of your work, because it's that I'm with my guests on the channel. It's always about bringing perspectives from as many different points of view as possible. And I love the pure military ex-colonel brigadier approach, and I love the students who've studied something. I love the eclectic idea of studying that war from as many different angles as possible, so we get a greater understanding of it. And you'll understand, I absolutely love that. I'll hold it up again there, folks. So Sheer Misery, Soldiers in Battle in World War II. I thoroughly recommend it. It's nice. It's not a pediatric Adams. Your postman won't get a hernia getting it, so bringing it. So it's a nice, fairly brisk read. So it's been a delightful talking to you. So thank you very much, and some nice conversations in the sidebar that I'll go back and read later on. So thank you very much. And folks, I'll just take you off screen for a second. I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. I'll bring you back in a minute. So, folks, tomorrow our show is an unusual time, 1:30 p.m. UK time. Al Murray, the comedy and podcast legend, is coming on to talk about his book Command, where he looks at 10 different figures from World War II, Montgomery included, and discusses their ability to learn and improve and get through World War II. So Al Murray has been known about my show for 2 years, but finally I've got him on my channel. So that'll be tomorrow. And so 1:30 UK time afternoon, so an unusual one. But I'm going to bring Mary Louise back in to say goodbye. So thank you very much. It's been great, wonderful talking to you. And I hope our paths cross again.
Yes,
thank you very much.
I really enjoyed this conversation. Your questions were so right on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So thanks, everybody. This is Paul Willis for World War II TV. So I'll see you all next time. Bye.